Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. If you'd like to jump directly to a specific point in the video, you can tap or mouse over the video playback area of the screen to reveal the chapter titles and starting points of each section. In this week's Casual Friday podcast, I have tidbits. I have an update to my hand spinning fiber breed study, and I have 2 finished objects. So let's get started. For this first tidbit, I have a photograph. It was actually on an Instagram account. It was the link was sent to me by a self-described World War II history nerd named Robin. And the reason she sent the link to this photograph is because she's really intrigued by the sweater and a couple of elements in the construction. So first of all, this is a Finnish soldier named Viljo Walter Suolkas, I believe, is as close as I'm going to get with my accent. He has a big scar on his face. He had been injured, and then I think within a year or two, he died in another attack. He was wounded and was not able to be evacuated out. But his sweater has a couple of interesting elements to it. One is that the ribbing at the bottom of the body is very deep. It's much longer than you would normally see. Now, I could think of a couple of reasons why that might be. One is to allow it to be rolled up and still stay hugged to the body. Particularly at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century, it was very common for sweaters to be extremely long and then rolled up. And I'm not completely sure why that is, if it was a fashion thing, if the idea was so that the bottom of the hem could be unrolled to cover the rear end if you were outside and standing around, and then you could roll it up if you were ice skating or doing whatever your your activity was. That could be one reason. Another reason might be if the sweater by World War II wasn't as long, but the ribbing was very deep. I can think of a couple of reasons why that might be. One would be so that it could be easily tucked into trousers, so that it would conform to the body and be put into trousers. I know for World War I don't know if this was a past thing by the time World War II came around, but I know in World War I, cholera belts were something that knitters often made for soldiers, and the idea was that somehow you could avoid getting cholera if you kept your abdomen warm. So it's possible that that was another way, even if the sweater itself wasn't as long as it would have been at the beginning of the 20th century, that having that ribbing might allow the hem to be rolled up a bit and keep the abdomen warmer. Maybe. No idea for sure, but it certainly is an interesting detail. At the shoulders, what you see is there is saddles that are made from garter stitch. So this isn't something we see a lot now, but the shape of the shoulders was very common in the early part of the 20th century and in the late 19th century. And that was that there wasn't any shoulder shaping. Men's sweaters were often knit in one long strip for the body, from the bottom of the ribbing up to the shoulders, and then you create an opening as you were knitting that direction, and then you just knit the back or the front, whichever half you started with. You would knit it exactly the same, and that way the sweater could be worn in either direction. It was reversible, and that would help with minimizing the kind of wear that you might get on the elbows. So I'm going to put a picture on the screen to kind of show you what that would look like. So basically the shoulders are a rectangle of garter stitch, and then inside that rectangle you have a smaller rectangle that is the neck opening. So again, there wouldn't have been shoulder shaping. It would have just been a stretchy stitch pattern to have up at the shoulders that would allow movement pretty easily and allow it to contract when it needed to. So there could have been some practical reasons for having garter stitch at the shoulders. But it's really fun to see that. I'm going to leave links to both of the Instagram accounts where this photograph appeared. The one that Robin sent me came from History Colored. So they show all kinds of historical black and white photographs that have been colorized. But they got this particular image from jhlcolorizing. That particular account specializes in colorizing Finnish war history. So that one's a very specialized account, where the other one might be a little bit more general. But both of those links will be down in the description. This next tidbit, I think that this came to me as a DM on Instagram, maybe? I'm not sure, and I really apologize to whoever sent it to me. But this is a video that is called Wool in the Pyrenees. So the Pyrenees Mountains, which are in northern Spain, you're right along the border between Spain and France, with little Andorra in there as well. This video is in the Aragonese Pyrenees. What it's showing is the traditional method of preparing wool textiles. So they start off with women who are down at the river washing raw fleece in the river, and so one woman's doing that, and another woman is washing clothes. So they're comparing the difference between how you wash clothes and how you wash wool, and how it needs to be treated differently. Once the wool has been washed and dried on the rocks on the banks of the river, then the women are sitting down with baskets, and they're going through the fleece, the clean fleece, by hand, picking out vegetable matter and other parts that wouldn't be good for spinning. So they have these baskets of fluffy wool that's been picked over. Then they use hand cards to card the wool. So this is a woolen preparation that's going to be fluffier than a worsted preparation, which would be combed. This is carded. This is to cause the fibers to be disorganized and going in all different directions, so that they trap more air, and the fabric can be lighter in weight but warmer than it would be with a worsted preparation, which has the advantage of being more wind resistant and harder wearing. So there's different reasons for different kinds of preparations. So after they have carded and created what are called rollags, they take those rollags and they wind them around a distaff. And so that's like a long piece of wood, like kind of like a pole that you wrap the fiber around as you prepare for spinning it. So their traditional method of spinning is to use a drop spindle, and it's one where the weight is at the bottom rather than the top. I have a spindle up here that I used before I took my first class on the spinning wheel. So this is a type of spindle where the weight was at the top, and then as I was spinning the fiber, then I would wind it around here, and these women are spinning in this direction instead, so the weight is at the bottom. Then they go on to show how they ply their singles, and they showed a couple of different methods. One of them, I wasn't really quite sure what was going on. It looked like really dense, almost rope or cord that they were creating, rather than something that you would want to knit with. All of the audio is in Spanish, and I'm not even sure which dialect of Spanish it might be, if it's Catalan or what, but in order to understand better what's going on, you can turn on closed captions and then select which language it is that you want the captions to be automatically translated into. So the translation is not going to be perfect, but it may be good enough for you to understand what's going on. After they showed all that spinning process, they also showed other ways that this wool can be used, like as the filler of a quilt, for example. So it's really interesting, pretty lengthy video that I found really interesting. I really like to see different ways, traditional methods of spinning wool into yarn. This next tidbit came up in my Twitter feed. I think it was just somebody that I follow must have retweeted it. And what it is a little short film that it's stop motion photography. So it's an animated little film, and the characters are tiny little knitted cats and people and objects. And it's just adorable. The name of the film is called How Hard Cats Work Between Naps, and so it shows all the kind of mischief that they get into. So I just loved this little film, and I'm going to show you a little clip of it that you can find on Giphy, where she has turned some of her animations into short little clips that you can look at. But she also has a website where you can see all her films. And you can also see, I think she sometimes does postcards made from stills of her films. I just find that it's so cute, but there's also a video that I found as I was trying to learn more about her, a video on YouTube. It's a BuzzFeed video, and they did like a little 4 to 5 minute feature on her and how she got started in knitting and how she got started in stop motion photography and a lot of like behind the scenes stuff. So you watch her setting up and doing the stop motion photography animation, so you can see kind of what's going on and how she does it. So all of that is really interesting. So she has an Instagram and a Twitter. One of them is mochimochiland and one's mochimochiworld. I can't remember off the top of my head which is which, but I'll leave the links down there. I'll also leave a link to her website as well as to that BuzzFeed video, because to me that was so interesting to see all of the inner workings of how she creates that magic. So this next tidbit is just to notify you all, if some of you longtime knitters, if you were knitting back in the 80s and 90s, you may have heard of a designer named Jean Moss. When I received my most recent copy of Slipknot, which is the booklet put out by the Knitting and Crochet Guild in the UK, they had an article about her that she had died this summer, and so there was an article about what her career was like. So I don't think that this is available to read online if you're not a member of the Knitting and Crochet Guild. I am going to link to the obituary that was written about her by her husband, about what her career was like and her life outside of knitting. You might also be interested in just seeing the kinds of things that she was designing back in the 90s. I had this is one of the book that I bought years ago. The copyright is 1991. And it's kind of interesting. I don't think I ever knit anything from this particular book, but there are so many things I could tell. I could tell why I bought this book. This was a time in my life when I did buy books that were just pattern books. They weren't necessarily reference books or technique books or books with any sort of historical context. So I bought quite a few books by designers from the UK, and in particular, quite a few of them who were designing for Rowan yarns. So like Kay Fassett and Sasha Kagan, and then also Jean Moss. Some of these are really interesting to look at again, especially as I'm thinking about this long-term project that I've been working on to knit a sweater from each decade from the 1890s to the 1990s. My thought had been I wouldn't knit one from the 1990s because I have a bunch of sweaters or several sweaters that I actually did knit in the 1990s. So why would I need to do that again? But it's possible I might select one from here. So I'll just briefly go through this in the overhead so that you can see what sorts of designs we're talking about. So she did a lot of color work, which could be intarsia, which was very popular at the time. So here's another intarsia sweater. But she also did some stranded color work patterns as well, like you can see here. And you can see then she combined that with a cable knit sleeves, which is kind of a cool thing as well. So another color work using Fair Isle patterns. This very much screams late 80s, early 90s to me. This sweater caught my eye. I really love this. And what's interesting, I thought, well, that looks to be pretty fine gauge. And it's knit with a 2-ply Shetland wool, which is the equivalent of a 4-ply fingering weight. So this is the kind of wool that is used like in Shetland hats and sweaters and things like that. So sometimes I believe they call this jumper weight. So I was like, oh, that's beautiful, but oh, that's a lot of knitting. But one of the things I really like about this, I am a sucker for a shawl collar, and I love this particular collar right here because it has a cable coming up the side as well. So I just love that. I think it's gorgeous, and even if I don't think I would knit something like this in a very fine gauge, I really do want to take a look at that particular neck to see exactly how it's constructed. Lots of cables, lots of intarsia, lots of roomy sleeves. That was very much more common back then. Combination of some texture with intarsia. So these, you know, it's interesting to see these kinds of sweaters because the yarns are all solid color. There's a lot of patterning going on, but the yarns are all solid. You don't see the tonal yarns and the speckle yarns and those kinds of things that are so popular now from hand indie dyers. But I really like these types of motifs where the work is in the stitch pattern and not so much in the yarn. This tidbit came to me again in my Twitter feed, and I'm not sure. I think, again, it must have been something that was retweeted either by somebody in textiles that I follow or one of the historians that I follow. I'm not sure how I happened to see this. It's a Gullah sweetgrass basket. So I had heard in the past few years about a culture of people that were enslaved people from Africa that had been brought to the coastal areas of South Carolina, and they were so isolated on the plantations and some of them on actual islands off the coast. For generations, they were pretty isolated from other people, and they developed a Creole language called Gullah, or Gullah, and sometimes Gullah Geechee. They brought with them, when they were enslaved and forced to come over here from Africa, they had many skills in terms of raising livestock and in planting crops, as well as in creating these really cool baskets. So I always think of baskets as being woven, but these are actually sewn baskets, and they're held together with rings of this sweetgrass. Those coils are held together by sewing them with other sweetgrass or another plant fiber of some sort. I thought it was really interesting, but there's an entire thread associated with that one post, which was from the Gullah Museum of South Carolina. So they posted a series of photos of these different kinds of baskets and how they're almost indistinguishable from baskets that are still being made in Africa today. So they just preserved that method of craftsmanship for hundreds and hundreds of years. So there's a museum in South Carolina in Georgetown that really is devoted to this particular culture and to the language. So I'm going to leave you a link to that Twitter thread about specifically that are about the baskets, but also to the museum, because to me it's just a fascinating part. I am not from, I've lived in the Midwest my entire life. I don't know a lot about the South. I certainly didn't know much at all about this particular language or the culture of those descendants of slaves that are known as the Gullah Geechees. So every year about this time, end of September, beginning of October, is Shetland Wool Week. And so there is typically a calendar of events all over the Shetland Islands that are related to Shetland Wool Week. And so the idea is it really brings in money into this area, and it puts the spotlight on Shetland wool. So I had sort of vaguely heard of this before at the beginning of the pandemic a year and a half ago, but I never really paid attention to it. Started hearing people talking about, oh, they're going to announce the hat for Shetland Wool Week soon, and do we know if Shetland Wool Week is going to happen, and all of this. So I started paying attention. I couldn't go anywhere. I couldn't go to knitting events. So everything I was doing was online. What they do for Shetland Wool Week or every year is they select somebody who has to do with the Shetland wool community to come up with a theme and or design for the hat. So the year that I did it, the person who came up with the idea for what should be in the hat was not the person who actually designed it. It was somebody who maybe a sheep farmer, I'm not sure, but it was called the roadside beanie, and it had the kinds of things that you would see from the roadside on Shetland Islands, which is sheep and then water and boats. So this was a designer then created this hat to go with that theme. So this was the 2019 hat, and the 2020 hat came out shortly after that. And of course they couldn't have Shetland Wool Week last year, which is a real hardship on that community that really relies on the tourism and the influx of people coming in order to celebrate Shetland Wool Week. But it is going on this year, and it starts Tuesday, 28th of September, and it goes through October 6th. So that came up in my feed. The reason it came up, because I just hadn't been thinking about it, was because I got interested in Shetland wool last year and started really paying a little bit more attention. I started following a woman who has a sheep farm on one of the islands, and she has a YouTube channel called Barkland Croft, and I think it's called A View from Fair Isle. I think she's actually on the island of Fair Isle. And so she kind of films what's going on with her farm. And so she was the one who alerted me that Wool Week is coming up, and she has yarn that was milled from her sheep's fleeces. And I thought, well, that's really cool. And I thought I would also look into what the hat was for this year, because I hadn't looked it up. So this is what the hat is. And once again, what they do when the hat is designed, it is shown in 5 different colorways. You can, of course, knit it in whatever colors you want, but they have 5 different companies that sell Shetland wool. 2 of them are the big 2 companies that I know of. One's called Jamieson's of Shetland, and the other is called Jamieson and Smith, and which they get confused a lot between people. So those are the big 2, and then there are 3 others, one of which has organic Shetland wool. Then there is one where you can pick wool that is hand spun, and I believe these are all from Natural Colors. And then there is a 5th option as well. So I'm going to put all of the names on here. I'm going to put a link to the website for Shetland Wool Week, where you can get the free hat pattern, and then you can see all of the different colorways. And I will also leave a link to the Barkland Croft, to her website, and also to her YouTube channel if you're interested in seeing what a shepherd's life is like on Fair Isle. Last week for my breed study, I had started spinning the Rambouillet, but I hadn't finished it. So this week I did finish the Rambouillet, and I spun the next breed that's alphabetical, which is Romney. So this is a breed that I've heard spinners talking about, and I've heard them talk about how much they like it, but it is not a breed where I have come across yarn. Even now that I am, finding sources of rare breed yarns from here and there, I haven't seen any commercially spun Romney yarn. Now, I did check my copy of Fleece and Fiber to see what they said about Romney, and they did mention that, it's not something that a knitter is going to be able to find typically, unless somebody who raises Romney sheep has their yarn milled and sells it, that might be a way that you find Romney. Of course, this book was written a couple of years ago, and things may have changed since then. Romney is considered a conservation breed. What the Fleece and Fiber source book said was that spinners just love it, and I can see why. I loved spinning the Romney. It feels like wool to me. It feels soft enough to wear as a sweater. I don't know that I'd want it next to my skin, but even the sweater that I'm wearing, which is knit with a superwash, I don't know, something fancy. It's a superwash fingering weight yarn. I think it's like Dream in Color Smooshy or something like that. I still wear a camisole under it because I don't like anything next to my torso. I can stand it on my arms, but I don't like anything next to my skin. This is not a sweater I can wear very much in the winter because it's just not warm enough in the climate that I live in. So typically I do wear a heavier sweater, worsted weight, or sometimes bulky, and I always have a long sleeve shirt on underneath that. So I just expect to not be wearing wool next to my skin. And to me, Romney feels like the kind of wool I would love to knit a sweater out of. This is definitely going on my list of wools that I want to explore more thoroughly in the future. And this is a great thing that I've learned from this. So I'm going to go to the overhead so we can look a little bit more closely at these two particular wools. So these are my two bobbins of Rambouillet, and this is my bobbin of Romney. So it's a little, I don't know if you can see kind of that there's a little bit of hair sticking out from it. It's just a little hairier. It's just little hair sticking out from it. Where with the Rambouillet, it's very, very smooth. You don't get those kinds of hairs sticking out from it. So this is really fascinating to me, to kind of do these one after the other. This is the Rambouillet and this is the Romney. That I have enough bobbins that I had both of my Rambouillet bobbins spun, and I hadn't done the plying yet when I started the Romney. So I was able to compare what was on the bobbin to each of them. They had felt very similar to spin with, and eyeballing it, they looked like the singles were pretty similar. I ended up, I believe, with more yards of this, at least before it was, the yarn was finished. It may have shrunk up a bit after it was washed, which might be why it has more bounce. This is definitely a less, it's squishy, it's just not squishy like the Rambouillet is. The other thing that's interesting is that this is more of a matte finish. Like it doesn't really reflect light, where there's sheen to this. So it would be interesting to see how dye would be affected if I were to dye each of these. So this is one of the things I just love about this breed study, is that I get the chance to compare all of these different breeds and kind of keep notes and pay attention. But in particular, being able to knit these two one after the other and see what the differences in them were, and know that it wasn't, oh, well, I spun these 6 months apart and my spinning has changed. And I spun these, a day or two apart from each other. So that has been really interesting. So the first finished object that I have is the bonnet that I started last week. Let's see, here it is. And it's called Beloved. It's by Tin Can Knits. I'll leave a link down below. The yarn that I used is Belfast Mini Mills Island Collection Superwash Merino wool, and the color is Plum Heather. So I talked a little bit about the construction of this hat last week. It starts with the I-cord. It comes up to the corner of the hat. You do increases, and then you are working the hat sideways, increasing all the way. And there's some short rows as well to give more room here, but also so that you aren't creating as much length at the back of the neck as you have across the front. In the second half, you are doing decreases, and then you end with the I-cord at this end. So you had only 2 yarn tails to weave in, and you just weave them in by running them up the center of the I-cord. Really the easiest weaving in of any project I think I have ever knit. Now the way that I finish a sweater once it's completed is I always wash and block. And so Tuesday's Technique Tuesday video, I thought, oh, well, I'm washing and blocking this hat. I've never done a video on how to do that kind of a thing. So I explained how, not only how I washed and blocked this particular hat, but just in hats in general, how I do that. So I mentioned one thing about this particular yarn is that it is Z-plied. So when you are spinning yarns, you have the singles that are created, and typically in most commercial yarns these days, the singles have what is called a Z twist. And then when you ply them together, you twist them in the opposite direction, and that creates so that they become an S-ply. So they're twisting in a particular direction. For hand knitters, as most knitters who knit in the what's called the Western style, it could be continental, could be English. It's the direction that the yarn goes around the needle as you're knitting, and I'll link to some videos that explain what I'm talking about. When you do that, it will add some twist to a yarn that was S-plied. But if you're using a Z-plied yarn, which twists in the other direction, you're going to lose a little bit of twist. And that did happen, and it's not enough that it creates a problem. One thing is I use very pointy needles, and so it did loosen enough that I tended to, my pointy needle tended to split it every so often. So if I were going to use that yarn again, I would choose to use a blunter needle. When I talked about this yarn, I said it was Z-plied. It had a final Z twist. And I mentioned that this company, Belfast Mini Mills, is in Canada. And so somebody asked me, well, if they're Canadian, wouldn't it be called a Z twist? And they spelled out Z, Z-E-D. And so the answer is, the way it's spelled is with the letter, a dash, and then plied. And so if you live in the United States, you are going to pronounce that Z-plied. If you live in Canada or the UK or one of the other UK-associated countries that speak English, you are going to pronounce that Z-twist. But the way it's spelled is the same, no matter what country you live in. Oh, the other thing I wanted to say about this yarn is this pattern called for a DK weight yarn. And the gauge was 22 stitches over 4 inches or 10 centimeters. So that would be 5.5 stitches per inch. That's pretty standard for a DK weight yarn. I knew I wanted to use a superwash wool because it's for a baby, and I wanted the mom to be able to at least throw it in the wash, even if it's on the gentle cycle. But one of the things about superwash wools is that they tend to be a little limp and they can stretch. And so you wash them and they'll go back into shape again. So one of the ways that I combat those qualities of superwash wool, if I am knitting with them, is to knit them at a little bit firmer gauge. That helps them hold their shape a little better. So this is a worsted weight wool, but I just knit it at the firmer gauge called for of 5.5 stitches per inch. And the hat is not too stiff at all after it's been washed. It's has plenty of drape to it, so it's not like it's a helmet or something like that. So that was just what I wanted to mention about the yarn that I used versus what's called for in the pattern. So this next project is a spontaneous project that I started and finished yesterday. I have been working on this vintage sweater from the 1960s for months. Like, I think I started it back in March or maybe even February. And I knit it off and on. I finished it earlier this summer. I was so sick of it. And it's needed to be seamed up. So now that I have my 1950s sweater completed, I thought, okay, I'm going to work on my 1960s. And I was working on the seaming, and then I did one of them, and I'm like, oh, I don't like this seam. I need to rip it out and redo the seam. And I was fed up, and I didn't want to do it yesterday. So I decided to knit a different hat instead. And it was one that had come up in the comments of last week's video when I was talking about the beloved bonnet with the little ties. And somebody mentioned this Aviatrix hat. Looks like a little pilot's helmet with a strap on. I don't have a button on it yet. It's made in these wedges with a little garter stitch ridge separating them. They brought it up in the comments, and I was like, oh, I made one or two of those hats years ago. I loved it. I'd forgotten all about that hat. So I went and looked it up. It used to be a free pattern, but she's updated it. She's written the instructions or revised the instructions so you could use sport weight, I think DK or worsted weight. So you can use a variety of yarn weights, and they're in a range of sizes. So that you really have flexibility in terms of what materials you're going to use and what size you want to knit. So I was looking back through my old notes in my Ravelry notebook. I don't have a photo of these old hats that I knit. I might have one of them in a bin of hats here in my office, but I'm not sure. But I was reading my notes and I realized that this was the hat that I was knitting, or hat like this, when I was knitting back in 2010, when I first found a really cool short row technique that I thought was so much easier than wrap and turn short rows. And it was the technique that was in Big Book of Knitting. This is a book translated from German into English. And it was a technique that wasn't in any of my other knitting books. I've talked about this a few times in the past. The process was so much easier than other short row techniques. And the result was the same as Japanese short rows, which were very popular at the time because they looked so good. But they were really, I found, futzy to do, so I didn't want to use Japanese short rows, but I hated wrap and turn short rows, and I didn't really love any of the other short row techniques. So this one I loved because it was in this German translated book, and I couldn't find it anywhere, couldn't figure out if there was another name for it. The book calls them shortened rows with yarn pulled over needle, something like that. I was like, there's just a long description is the name of this technique. So I decided to call them German short rows. And sometime in the next year, when I really confirmed and kind of understood more about how this technique worked and how to substitute it in patterns that were calling for wrap and turn short rows, which was really the overwhelming majority of patterns at the time. So I was working it out in one of these hats. And what I would say, there's 6 wedges to this hat, and what I would say is if you want to compare short row techniques, this would be a really excellent way, because first of all, you start out knitting the longest short rows and you get shorter and shorter, and then you switch to getting longer and longer. So you get to see in both situations how that works when you are knitting shorter and shorter or longer and longer. And the other thing that makes this really handy for that is that the way that the instructions are presented allows you to easily substitute one short row technique for another. And that is because she does not say work this many stitches past the previous wrap or previous double stitch or whatever. She doesn't refer to the flag that marks where you turned before. She refers to how far you are from the end of the row when you turn, so that regardless of what kind of short row technique you are using, you are going to be turning at exactly the same point, which in my opinion is the correct way to substitute short row techniques, is to find the specific turning point and apply that technique. Some short row techniques place the wrap or the double stitch or the twin stitch or the yarn over, whatever it is, they place them in different locations relative to the actual turn. So I have a video about substituting one short row technique for the other. I have a couple of videos that could be really helpful to understand what it is I'm talking about. One of them is a comparison of short row techniques, where I talk about that there are kind of families of short row techniques and how different techniques are related to each other, and how they signal to you where you turned previously. And then I have a video on how to substitute one type of technique for another. But because there are so many different ways to present short row instructions, that they're not all the same. Not everybody does things the same way, and the way that you present instructions in some respects depends on the requirements of that particular pattern. But it can make substituting a little tricky. You have to think through how to substitute things in some situations, but in this one you do not. But it gives you the opportunity to make observations about what is going on if you choose to do that. So if you are wanting to experiment with different short row techniques or just knit a really cute baby hat, I would really recommend the Aviatrix pattern for doing that, because I think it could be eye-opening for people who are really interested in understanding more about short rows. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.